In this video, we're going to talk about hip hinging exercises, or simply hinging exercises, which are one of the functional movement patterns that we should train in every good strength training program. Hinging is a hip extension movement, and so hinging can be considered one of a broader category of exercises that involve this movement of hip extension, driven primarily by your glutes, okay? And the glutes are, when weak, a very problematic cause of low back pain and tight hips, and oftentimes is a neglected approach to improving low back pain and tight hips. Far more effective than stretching these areas is making sure you're doing adequate strengthening for these glutes. So again, the movement pattern involves going from a flexed position like so at the hips to an open position at the hip, through driving forward of the hips and contraction of the glutes. The other muscles involved in this movement are the hamstring muscles. And they're interesting muscles that run along the back of your legs. They attach at the sits bones, cross the hip joint, and they cross the knee joint and attach to the lower leg bone. And so effectively, this muscle assists with hip extension primarily when the knee angle remains fixed. And that's because the insertion here must remain stable in order for the hamstrings to be able to leverage power in hip extension, okay? So we have hamstring and glute involvement for the most part in hip extension. We're going to talk about variations of this exercise and how they differentially involve different muscles in hip extension and why we will do them in different ways over time. So first of all, there's variations of hip extension that have you in a recumbent position on the floor. And so in the most basic example of a hip extension exercise, we have a glute bridge, which involves lying on your back with your knees bent and your feet flat. And not everyone is comfortable lying in this position. So another option is to raise your feet on a bench. I call this a feet elevated glute bridge, but you can also call it a hip lift. And in both these forms of exercise, you want to be sure that you're adequately engaging your core before you actually perform the movement. And that should be done prior to each and every repetition, because oftentimes I'll hear people say they either feel it in their back, they feel it in their quads, or the backs of their knees. You don't want to feel it in those areas, and it's usually related to inadequate contraction of the abdominal muscles. So this is as much a core exercise as it is the glutes. So this is why I really do love these exercises, the glute bridge and this hip lift exercise with your feet elevated. So in both these instances, your knees and feet align with your hips, and you're going to engage your core forcefully by sort of drawing your belt buckle, as I say, towards your rib cage, lower rib cage. So it's in effect closing this space in front and feeling like you're corseting everything. And what you'll notice is your low back drops towards the ground. That contraction is important to maintain throughout the exercise. And then what you're going to do is contract your glutes, drive through the heels, and push your hips up like so. And you should really feel this primarily in the backs of your legs and in your glutes. And typically what I instruct is to hold at the top to really feel that contraction and then lower under control. And you want to reestablish that core engagement prior to every repetition, particularly if it's not a natural feeling. You want to feel like you're scooping your bum a little bit underneath in order to really transfer the work to where you want to feel it, okay? Now, in some cases, you can do a dumbbell hip thrust. So these will be present in some programs as you progress, because they're a little more you can load them a little bit more forcefully, and they're a little more technically challenging to get in and out of position. So what they involve is essentially resting your low back just below the shoulder blades on the bench like so, and walking your feet out. And you can place your feet wide, or you can place them in a hip width orientation. This will involve more of your glutes if you're a little wider. If you're quite narrow, you're going to feel more of the hamstrings. And so again, you can also creep your legs out so that the knee angle is wider, and the effect of having a wider angled position and a more extended knee will optimally recruit hamstrings and glutes. And so you can actually load this with a dumbbell, and in much the same way I tell the instruction is to engage your core, press up by pushing through the heels, squeeze the glutes, hold for 1, and then come down to here. You don't want to sit on the ground, you just stay floating here. And then you can come down. So a dumbbell hip thrust and glute bridging are variations of hip extension exercises. Then we come to true hinging exercises, and you can do these in a seated position. So in a seated good morning, you're basically setting up, and the way I like them done is with a wide foot position, knees slightly extended. So the knee should not be at 90, it should be a little bit wider. So walk the feet out and have them wider than shoulder width and the toes pointing outward. So if you were to see me from the front, it's kind of like this from the side. And the reason I'm going to shoot from the side is because here's where your back, the spine position becomes oh so important, okay? And I'll explain why in a moment, but the practice of a hinge should begin with a spine, something to feed back on the position of your spine, and I like the use of a broomstick. So just remove the broom from the stick, place it along your spine, and ideally it would touch behind your head, between your shoulder blades, towards the top of your back, and then your tailbone. And what you're aiming to do is flex the hip like so while maintaining those points of contact, and then come back up. Okay, so this is a basic seated good morning, it's called. And it's a hinging exercise. The trouble people can run into is that when they do this forward motion, rather than flexing at the hip and then extending at the hip, they're rounding their back and losing contact of the stick with their tailbone. And that's a sign that you're leveraging this kind of lifting using muscles of the low back rather than the hip muscles, meaning the glutes and the hamstrings. So you want to practice with that stick, doing that seated good morning. And your sits bones really do lift away from the seat, and sort of you're sort of tipping off of this position at the edge of the seat, okay? Once you come to a standing position, you can practice a standing hip hinge with your feet hip width apart, okay? So directly under the hip, okay? And so from the side, the cue would be the same. You're tipping like so at the hip. You're not bending your knees very much. You're maintaining a soft angle. You don't want to be locked out at the knee, nor do you want to flex the knee. Once the knees become involved, you're actually performing a squat, which drops the hip and the shoulders, but they stay relatively, your shoulders stay high and your hips drop down with your shoulders. In a hinge, your hips stay relatively high and they shove back. So some of the other cues we talk about with the hip hinge, in order to get the movement pattern correct, is think about pushing a drawer closed behind you with your bum. The other one is to think about pinching your own fingers in the hip creases. So if you were to push into the crease of your hip in front, at the bottom of the movement, you should feel that your fingertips are essentially squeezed between your thigh and your upper or your lower abdomen, okay? So with those cues in mind and practicing with the stick on your spine to ensure neutral spine position, then you can harness the power of your glutes and hamstrings to extend your hip and lift a load. Only once you're super comfortable with the pattern of hinging should you add load. So let's talk about how to load this movement in different ways. In the most basic way to load a hip hinge, you're standing with your hips hip width apart and holding a dumbbell like so. A single dumbbell held here can work when you're starting the load. This then becomes a Romanian deadlift. And you're holding your shoulders together at the top because you want to bear the load of the weight appropriately with your back muscles. You're not looking to hold it like so. Your arms are straight and it's being sort of suspended, if you will. But you want to be sure not to give in to the weight and round your upper back because that will cause rounding of the entire spine. So pull back, proud chest, and you hinge in the same way as you do with the stick on your back, okay? Once you feel like you've maximized what you can achieve with a lighter single weight, you can always do this movement with 2 weights held like this, okay? And ultimately with a barbell. And that's called a Romanian deadlift. That's the name of that exercise. But there are other exercises that load the pattern of hinging differently depending on foot position and where the weight is held. So now I'm going to talk about a good morning, a standing good morning, which is essentially the same exercise as I demonstrated in the seated position, only now you're standing. And I coach this exercise with a wide foot position. So right away it's different than the previous exercise in that your feet are wider than shoulder width and your toes are pointed out at a 45-degree angle, okay? This now involves hinging with your feet in that position. Note that my knees don't stay locked. They soften. They're bent, but not so bent. And I'm primarily, again, driving those hips back and tipping my torso down such that my shoulders come to this position. The loading of this movement involves putting the weight up here, like so. The simplest way to hold it is in front of your chest like this. So from the side, here's how it looks. And the difference here is now the foot position is wide, so we're recruiting more of the outer glute and hamstring, as well as stretching and recruiting some of the adductor muscles here in the inner thigh. And the other thing we're doing is we're holding the weight differently, which has the effect of overloading the movement in this bottom position by virtue of where the weight is held. When we hold a weight here, down low, we're overloading the movement right here. The weight overloads the movement the most when our torso and angle is at 45 degrees to the horizontal, compared with overloading it when our torso angle is 90 degrees to vertical or 0 degrees to horizontal. So there are reasons why we want to try doing hinging in different positions. One is for practicing movement patterning, the most functional of which is when we're standing. But we also want to overload this movement in different ways to leverage our strength differently. So the glutes are more maximally recruited when they're shortened in that tabletop position, as in a hip lift or a dumbbell thrust. But the standing variations offer important functional transfer in the sense that they represent ways that we move in life. So you want to practice lifting with your legs. So when you lift something in real life, practice this hinge so that you're using big muscles of the legs to lift and load and avoiding using that back. Okay, so that's a bit of an overview of hinging as a functional movement pattern and an explanation of some of the ways in which hip extension appears in your programs.